All right. Well, welcome everybody. Very excited to see everyone today. I am Christina Clayton, one of the co-directors of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. Welcome to today's webinar, Lend a Hand, a Crisis Management, Triage, and De-escalation Model with Dr. Kira Mauseth. We're so grateful that many of you could join us to learn more about this important topic. But first, our land acknowledgement. The Northwest Mhttc honors the many cultures and lands across our region, spanning Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. We also know that many of you may be from other lands as well, and so we honor those additionally. Specifically, our center is based in Seattle, and we sit on the traditional land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples, past and present, and we're grateful to them, people who are still stewarding these lands. The Mhttc Network is a nationwide network that is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. Our network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. There are also networks that are basically the same for addiction and prevention using the same structure. We support resource development, dissemination, and technical assistance and training for the mental health field. The Northwest Mhttc, pardon me, the Northwest Mhttc covers Region 10, and our center is based in Seattle at the University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Now, a little bit more about our Northwest Mhttc. Our goals are here essentially to accelerate adoption and implementation of mental health-related evidence-based practices, heighten awareness, knowledge, and skills of the workforce, foster alliances and address training needs among diverse partners, and ensure availability and delivery of free publicly available training and technical assistance like today. Our area of focus in Region 10 is evidence-based practices for serious mental health issues such as psychosis. However, we provide training on a variety of topics, as you will know or will know if you sign up for our newsletter. Our target workforce includes really anyone whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes. And we fulfill our mission by doing free training, self-paced online courses that are also free, live events, and learning communities. We offer a newsletter where you'd know about upcoming events and products. We have a resource library, research and practice briefs, and other on-demand content. To find out more about our goals, training opportunities, and resources, you can visit our website and sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media. A bit about language. It is always our intention to be mindful of using language that promotes recovery and culturally appropriate terminology. We encourage everyone to use language that demonstrates respect for a person's dignity and worth, and it's consistent with recovery-oriented practices that foster respect, dignity, and hope. Next, a few logistics. Due to the large audience, all folks are muted and you're not appearing on video. The presentation is being recorded, and the recording and slides and any handouts will be made available on our website in a few weeks, and you'll receive an email from Zoom with a link to where we post these resources on our website. We do archive all of our webinars and include slides for most all of them. You'll receive an email within 2 weeks on how to access a certificate of attendance. There are no formal CEUs available, but sometimes these can be used for licensing purposes if you need that. For within this webinar, we allow, chat and Q&A features. So the chat is really helpful if you have a technical issue, need assistance from our team, you want to say hi and share your location, seeing a lot of great things there. And if we had a poll and your technology wasn't working, if we were doing something more advanced like Poll Everywhere. But for questions related to the content, we ask that you put that in the Q&A box. And so what's helpful about that is I will be monitoring those throughout the presentation. We'll be answering as many questions as we can at the end. And so if you have a question for the content for Dr. Mauseth, please put that there. If you put it in the chat, we'll have to ask you to put it into the Q&A because Zoom doesn't let us copy and paste that. I don't know why. So we'll moderate and we'll get to those. And if we can't get to some of them, we'll make sure to ask Dr. Mauseth and we'll get that in our Q&A sheet. We generally have a question and answer and resource document that we produce as well after webinars. So we should be able to answer any questions there as well. Lastly, your feedback is crucial to our work, so we would appreciate your response to a very short survey. Just takes a couple of minutes after the session. Our team will share this link via the chat, probably about most 3/4 way in, and you'll also get a reminder via Zoom. We're required by SAMHSA to conduct the survey. We really appreciate your feedback, though, because we look at them, the presenters look at them, it's all confidential, and your participation helps to keep free training coming. Little disclaimer. Not going to read all of this. SAMHSA sponsors this work, but does not reflect or have any official position on our content. Now, the important part. We're so grateful to have Dr. Mauseth here today. During the webinar, we will occasionally post some links that may be of interest, either provided by Dr. Mauseth or our team. But first, we'd like to get to know you, so let's do some polls. So we're asking if you can please answer 2 questions. So scroll down to make sure you can do both answers. Please choose what best describes your role and also what best describes your workplace setting. Now, we have limited numbers of options that we can put here, and we know we'll miss out on someone. You can feel free to type an answer in the chat box if something is really not well represented here. And so we're just going to wait a few minutes. We have 175 people, and we are getting close to half answering, which is great. So we have a lot of behavioral health clinicians or therapists, a number in the lead on case manager or outreach worker. We have some educational and school settings, peers, a lot of others, as we often do. Folks are mostly looking like they're coming from a behavioral health setting or educational setting, but I'm really excited to see shelter or housing programs. I worked in those settings for years, and then, of course, a lot of others. So let's see, we're getting really close to many of you are participating, which is fantastic. We'll give just another 30 seconds or a minute. All right. I know folks are still responding, but in the interest of time, we will move ahead. And so we will share the results. Are we seeing the results, Gabrielle?
Results are being shared right now.
Perfect. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't still running. So yeah, we have a lot of folks, as you can see, from the settings we expect, and really great to see the different folks in other settings and roles. So thank you so much. And this is helpful for Dr. Mauseth as well to see who's in the audience today. If you need to, you might have to click the box to get the results off your screen. So I will do that, and then let's move on. Well, our speaker today is Dr. Kira Mauseth, and she's a practicing clinical psychologist who splits her professional time between seeing clients at Snohomish Psychology Associates, teaching as a senior instructor at Seattle University, and serving as a co-lead for the behavioral health strike team for the Washington State Department of Health. She also serves on the state's Disaster Medical Advisory Committee. Her work and research interests focus on resilience and recovery from trauma, as well as disaster behavioral health. She has worked abroad extensively in disaster response and with first responders and healthcare providers throughout the United States. Dr. Mauseth also conducts trainings and provides presentation to organizations and educational groups about disaster preparedness and resilience training within local communities. We're very, very excited to have you. So, Dr. Mauseth, we have had the pleasure of having you on some of our events before, which if people haven't seen, we can certainly make sure people know you did a lot of work for us. But first question I guess I would have is, how did you come to work in this part of the field?
Yeah, disaster behavioral health is something that I really have been interested in for a long time. And my first deployment was to the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And I enjoy disaster science work and recovery and response because it allows me to work as a clinician in a context that's pretty unusual and unique, but also that it highlights and spotlights the incredible capacity for resilience and the capability that humans have to recover from things that even in the darkest moments of pretty significant and severe trauma and disasters, people usually are able to work through with each other in community or even on an individual level. And so doing that work, for me at least, is very rewarding in that way, because you get to see resilience in action all the time, in a lot of different contexts, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, you might have answered this, but what inspires you to keep this focus? Because I would imagine it's overwhelming, it's complex, it is traumatic, and you're diving headfirst into this. So how do you remain focused on this topic, and what inspires you each day?
Well, I think that I probably have a lot in common with a lot of the folks in the audience today, because I do the behavioral health work primarily because I like supporting my fellow human, and I appreciate the opportunity to get to work with people in various aspects of their lives and functionings. And unfortunately, obviously, for many of us, disasters have become a more frequent part of our experience across the country, certainly not just with the pandemic, but in the hurricanes and floods, and in seeing the folks in the audience today from all over the country. There are such a variety of challenges that we're all being faced with. And giving people and having the opportunity to share with them some of the information we have about disasters and about what people go through and how we can best work with that to achieve, the most resilience or the most positive or optimal outcomes for people is something that I really appreciate being able to do, because it normalizes it. We were speaking earlier about how right now with the pandemic, most people feel like they've got symptoms of ADHD and they're worried about cognitive functioning. And I love being able to share how normal that is, because it really validates what people are experiencing and going through.
Yeah, and I'm struck also in thinking about some folks, perhaps like yourself, sought out to do crisis work. And then there are way more folks who a crisis lands at our doorstep or remains at our doorstep. And we didn't choose that. And so I know you will talk about that and have talked about that in past talks about crisis work is everywhere, whether you chose it or not. How would you say crisis management in the field has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I think you sort of spotlighted exactly one of the issues that we're having, is that whether you signed up for it or not, most of us are having to manage crises, not just in our professional lives and work, but in our day-to-day lives with our families and with our kids and with our colleagues at work. And there are varieties of ways in which crisis is manifesting itself right now that makes this particular topic and the need to understand about de-escalation and other intervention strategies and techniques even more important when you consider the context of disasters layered on top of that as well. So certainly across generations and across different aspects of how we function day to day, crisis management is becoming a norm in some ways. And having that information is, I think, a helpful technique. It's a helpful tool in the toolkit. And it's something that, particularly for those of us who work in support of other people in wherever they happen to be in their life experience, it's a really valuable piece of information to have.
When you mentioned feeling like our cognition perhaps is being affected and not knowing that everyone, when I heard you say that in a previous webinar, that really resonated. What have you heard from people suffering from all the various traumas and crises that we're dealing with, as people are putting in the chat? Elders, we have family, we have school, we have just being fearful about our health. What are the things that you've seen in common that, might normalize just where people are at today, just, before we launch into the other stuff?
Well, one of the biggest considerations neurologically that's happening is that most of us, because we're so exhausted, and this applies to children and youth just as much as it applies to adults for sure, is that our brains are so tired because we're in what we call now a disaster cascade. So we've been dealing with the pandemic at the very least for more than 18 months. And most communities and most areas in the country have experienced a cascade disaster effect with a flood or a hurricane or a fifth wave like we experienced with the Delta variant that has taxed already lowered and sort of depleted mental, emotional, and physical resources in a lot of ways, which increases the likelihood of crisis and of the necessity, for crisis management. So the context of all of this in the disaster cascade absolutely plays a role in our day-to-day lives on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, it's so helpful to hear that there are things beyond our control that are affecting our ability, not just the crisis itself, but just the stress and how it affects us will affect our ability and to be extra kind and nurturing. And
the emotion regulation piece is something, and the exhaustion are things that are just very, very consistent across the board. People are having trouble regulating the emotional response to, when another driver cuts you off, or you get a text message or an email, like that ability to control that emotional reaction is very limited for most people right now. And again, children and youth as well. So that's one of those sort of neurological norms that most of us are going through.
Yeah. I know you have a lot of great models, and we'll be going into Lend a Hand, a crisis model you created. How did you arrive at this? How did you come up with this?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Lend a Hand was derived from all of the different pockets of research and work that I have been involved in for about the last 13 years. So it started with some of my postdoc and my residency actually in a correctional setting, and based on best practices for de-escalation and how to work on calming people down in a potentially sensitive or dangerous physical situation. And then I added disaster relief experience into that mix in my work with refugee camps, and based on the evidence that we were sort of collecting and some of the data from working in large groups, as well as the information that was coming out of clinical psychology and organizational psychology for in the workplace. So Lend a Hand is designed to sort of capture the best practices and the evidence on the most current research from all four of those disciplines, and put it into an acronym, which I love to use because it helps me remember things and sort of summarize things. So that's how it was developed.
That's fantastic. And we'll make sure that in all arenas, we'll have references to this and other models that you've done. How do equity issues impact situations of crisis and or crisis management? I know it's a very broad question, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's another great question. It's certainly embedded, and it needs to be a consideration in all of our behavioral health work for sure. But there are two primary ways. One is what I was mentioning a minute ago about the lack of emotion regulation that we all face, right? Keeping in mind that even those of us who are trying to intervene as a crisis manager are also struggling with the same, or potentially being challenged by the same neurological difficulties with regulating our responses. It creates sort of a cultural norm where people are a little bit more on edge. So that's part of it. But the consideration specifically with equity is that when our brains are already tired, we are more likely to jump to conclusions about things. We're more likely to misperceive input as potentially being dangerous just because it's something that is unfamiliar to us. So when we're working with people from a different gender identity or religion or ethnicity or background that is something that we personally are less familiar with, the neurological tendency may be, in a lot of cases, to make an assumption about risk or danger, when in fact what we need to do is try to pause and use different evaluative criteria or engage support with other colleagues who might have more experience in that area, so that we're not inappropriately judging something as being pathological or as being risky or dangerous, when in fact there might be a normative element to that is a function of our lack of knowledge about a particular group.
Well, that's fantastic to hear explained, and I imagine it goes the other way as well. Folks in crisis seeking support have many valid reasons that they have concerns about what's threatening or what's a risk, and that would be heightened for them as well. So to just remember that is coming from both sides, and everyone is just the temperature is very high right now.
Absolutely correct.
And so that leads me to my last question. How, in a nutshell, how can people take care of themselves right now when doing this work that they may have chosen or they didn't seek out, but it is here? What have you learned from working with folks who are showing that resilience?
Well, this is coming from the industrial organizational psychology data and research, but the primary way to reduce burnout is to try your best at the establishment and maintenance of healthy boundaries around your time. And we are not good at that in behavioral health work culture and in healthcare culture in general. We try to be on and less on. And what we need to be is on, and then potentially on call and off. And we need to protect our off time and be doing things either at, on our weekends or in the evenings that are unrelated as possible to our day job, and really try to create some significant separation between those two things. Burnout is very, very directly related to a lack of boundaries around things. And so that is difficult to do, but if you are able to establish and maintain those boundaries, it's a very effective way to reduce burnout and to reduce exhaustion.
Yeah, and I think in this virtual world that a lot of us are now constantly able to be on in any number of ways, notifications on your phone, pinging you. It's hard not to feel like you have to be responsive, but it sounds like really still striving for some off time is really key. So, well,
you can't pour tea out of an empty teapot, right? You have to make sure that you are taken care of before you can continue to help others. And it becomes a mission critical issue at this point in a long-term disaster, for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Mauseth, for having this informative conversation. I know we have more to come, but we really appreciate your time on these questions.
My pleasure, for sure.
We will get to your content. So sorry, I have a little blip in my slides, but we will now turn it over. I'll stop sharing and then let you get on with your presentation. So thank you so much.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I was going to say good morning, but when I saw in the chat where everybody was coming from today, I recognized that it's not morning everywhere. So I do have the ability here. I don't think I can. Well, maybe I can. Oh, I can. I can pull the chat up. I can pull up the Q&A. So I do encourage you to ask content-related questions, as Christina was indicating earlier, in the Q&A, so that we can follow up on those towards the end of the webinar. But what I'd like to do right now is go ahead and jump into Lend a Hand as a crisis intervention model. Can you all see that okay? I'm assuming that everything's working out well on the screen.
Yes, it's all great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so we were kind of referencing this just a second ago when we were having our discussion about the fact that in the context of such a large scale or a set of large scale disasters all over the country, everyone becomes a crisis manager sort of unwittingly, even if that's not the role that you particularly signed up for. So learning how to offer and to recognize behavioral health needs and interventions around crisis and around acuity of care becomes a really helpful tool. It's not something that I would expect everybody to want to be an expert in or to sort of engage in every day, because it takes a lot of energy to do this. And because none of us are immune from the experience of this disaster that is our context right now, all of our level of individual energy and capacity to support other people in crisis is something we really need to be aware of. How much energy and how much willingness do I have to engage in active listening, say, as an example of an intervention? We know active listening is effective, but we also know that you have to be able to express empathy in order to actively listen. So if you are suffering from compassion fatigue, it challenges your ability to engage in active listening and thus effectively, in some parts, engage in crisis management. So part of this, this model in general requires being very mindful about the changes and the shifts in your personal capacity and ability to engage in the effective ways that you might need to with other people. And then recognizing that probably your colleagues in whatever types of work that you do are also kind of trying to manage and be mindful of the same thing. And it's really important to try and maintain connection and reach out and support each other in that process as we go through it. So identifying ahead of time as you think about the next few months, heading into the fall and winter months when the weather changes for most places. I don't know if there are any folks from Southern California or the South, but the weather tends to shift in the northern latitudes, and the hours of darkness certainly impact people's behavioral health and sense of well-being. So what are the supports and the structures that you can put in place for yourself now to anticipate the necessity for a little bit more crisis management coming up in the next few months as we head into this season on the heels of this disaster cascade? Oops. I got my cursor in the wrong spot. There we go. So I want to start out by talking about the escalation cycle. This is a little snapshot from Seattle Children's, which I really appreciate because it summarizes the neurological pattern of activity that people experience when they go through crisis. So everybody comes in at a baseline, and represent. Yay, Seattle children. This represents the baseline where people come in, and that's different for everyone, right? Each person has a different sort of internal baseline that they are comfortable with about, sort of where their body is operating on a neurological level. And then we go through the yellow escalation zone up into red or blue, depending on someone's experience of the crisis, and then back down. And then the gray zone, which is the post-recovery, sort of, it can feel like shock. It can be when people are experiencing physiological symptoms where they're sort of numb or cold, and they're very still, and then back up to baseline. So it is very much like a wave that sort of is something that people can experience. And what we want to emphasize, or what I'm choosing to emphasize today with this model, is that the intervention power really lies in the yellow zone. It's in trying to prevent the wave from breaking before it gets there. After someone is in the red zone, there are de-escalation techniques. We're sort of using some of these words interchangeably, so it kind of gets confusing. But there are de-escalation techniques that can help someone calm down. But getting adrenaline out of the body is a function of time and space, right? That is a time window from 30 to 60 minutes usually, right? That not a single behavioral health, like a cognitive intervention, is going to do much to influence. So the de-escalation power tends to occur in the initial escalation zone when people are getting upset. And you can help them stay safe and not make impulsive or rash decisions potentially in the de-escalation other yellow zone. But when someone is clearly in the red or blue zone, the options are more limited, or tend to be more limited from a psychological perspective. So we go into the post-crisis gray zone and then back up to baseline. And this is sort of the physiological pattern that people experience. Credit to Seattle Children's and the psych unit where this was originated. I want to make sure to call that out. So the way that I work with this in private practice and with clients who are experiencing panic attacks or significant anxiety is to really emphasize control, like where the control lies. And if you have the opportunity in your work prior to when someone is actually in crisis, to share this sort of psychoed information with them. A lot of what happens when people are in sort of a general anxiety or even a panic disorder place is that they have experienced their symptoms to the degree where they don't feel that they have much control over the situation. And in their perception, it feels like it's the weather that happens to them from the outside in. And what we really want to emphasize in this process is that there is physiological and neurological potential to learn how to control part of this cycle. And sometimes just by sharing that information with people, it's incredibly empowering because they might not have considered the fact that their body is creating this from the inside, and that therefore they have the opportunity or the potential to learn how to control it and to regain some power over their own lives. So there are different techniques that you may use if this is a client or a patient with whom you are familiar versus a stranger that's coming into a hospital or an ED setting. There are different techniques slightly that you would use for obviously a panic attack versus if someone is angry and raging around. There are a lot of overlaps, but there are some distinct differences, and I will try to point those out as we move forward. So in general, active listening and engaging with the person to try and understand what's really going on sort of underneath the behavior is a very helpful intervention. I'm sure active listening is something that you all are familiar with, and many of you probably use on a day-to-day basis, but please don't underestimate its utility in this process. It is incredibly helpful for this. And then lend a hand is meant to be a triage model that you can apply with also the context of active listening in order to evaluate and really get a clear snapshot about potential risks and what might be the next best step for the person in need. So LEND, the acronym LEND, stands for the actions to take. These are the steps in the process that we take. So in clinical psychology, we talk about process and content, right? So LEND is the process. We listen, engage, notice, and decide. And then we assess for content. And hand represents the content areas. We want to assess health. We want to assess available resources. We want to assess narrative, and we want to assess danger. And I'm going to point out as we move through these where certain equity considerations come into play and sort of some of the differences between panic and anger in general. So the first step is the first for a reason. The listening part is probably the most important. And if there's one takeaway from this entire presentation, it's this idea that active listening is the 5-star recommendation for de-escalation. Now, I know I recognize that I said that, when you're struggling and suffering with compassion fatigue as a provider in this disaster context, having the capacity and ability to really, truly engage in active listening is a hard thing to do. It's a challenging thing. But please keep in mind that anger, particularly, is often, for lack of a better term, a bodyguard. Right? Anger protects people many, many times. Not always. I don't want to make that generalization, but many times. Anger protects people from other emotions that are less tolerable, more difficult to experience, and harder to express. Anger is much more culturally acceptable in the United States. It's more okay for people to get upset and get mad about something than to express fear or to express sadness. And those emotions in general are neurologically harder to access, they're deeper, and they're more uncomfortable. So when we do active listening, we are listening for what is underneath. We're listening for the thing that the anger may be protecting us or the other person from in terms of their experience. So asking those clarifying questions, continuing to go after the open-ended questions, who, what, where, when, why, how, and seeking with the intention of understanding and empathizing, not to fix or problem solve. That is probably one of the most uncomfortable pieces of de-escalation and crisis intervention is being wary of not trying to jump in and fix something to make ourselves feel safer or more comfortable, right? When in fact, what actually will help with the de-escalation is to fully listen and engage, which is the next piece of the model, with the angry person to fully understand their experience. That right there, that process takes the wind out of the sails, so to speak, and really helps someone move more quickly through that escalation cycle or prevent it from even going into that red zone that we were talking about a second ago. The next step with LEND, this process, is to engage. So that could be active listening. That could be making sure physically that you find a space to sit and talk to them to really indicate in such a way that you're invested in understanding what's really going on with them. It might mean engaging other resources. Now, I know I just said we don't want to problem solve or try to fix things for people, but sometimes, especially as people are in the recovery zone or in the de-escalation on the other side of the crisis, that's the time when their brains might be working out the adrenaline and they need concrete suggestions for what to do next, right? So there's a time and a place for it. It's usually after the active listening has taken place. So here's someone to talk to. Here's a next step, or here's a phone call to make, or here's a resource that maybe you didn't know was available for you. So you got to be mindful about the specific circumstances, which you learn more about in the listening process, and then engaging with that person to really find some good things that are fit for them. The fourth bullet on this slide is one of my, I think it's just a really important takeaway, and it might not be something that you've thought about before. It is really important from a de-escalation lens to try and sit down next to someone rather than across from them, or try to stand next to them. There are a couple things that does. Number one, it is very difficult to physically be aggressive when someone is side by side with you rather than straight in front of you. So there's a risk factor there that's reduced. Number two is that there's a psychological component. When you're in allyship with someone, you're next to them against the problem that is facing you both. So if you're on the same side of a table or on the same side of a desk or in chairs sitting next to each other, you're in allegiance with that person against whatever is in front of you together. And there's a really strong psychological component of that just don't underrepresent how important that is. The next one, the final one on the list, is about not blocking access to the exits. And one of the misconceptions in de-escalation is that you need to be able to access the door if you're working with someone who's angry so that you can escape. The research shows that the opposite is actually true. Now, ideally, both parties would have equal access to the door. But if that cannot be arranged, you want to make sure that the angry person can get out and leave so that they don't have to go through you or over you to do it. And that's one of those challenging sort of mental steps. but to make sure that they have access to an exit is very, very important, because sometimes when people feel completely flooded, they need to escape. Now, in certain hospital settings, that might not be an option, but in many other settings, that's a realistic possibility. So keeping in mind the setting, try not to block exits and try to sit next to someone. I'm putting Gottman's emotion coaching in here. Again, I think that's something that most of you here in the audience today are probably familiar with or have heard at some point. But the reason why is because it takes active listening and sort of breaks it down into these reasonable and more manageable steps. It's about thinking about how to do really an active application of active listening. So being aware of emotions, recognizing the expression of emotion, even anger, as an opportunity to connect with someone. And when we're really trying to understand, we're not shaming, criticizing, discounting, dismissing. There's nothing that's going to make an angry person more angry than dismissing whatever it is they're mad about. Or what in reality, what's happening is that you're dismissing their fear. What's happening maybe underneath and saying that's not important, or you shouldn't be worried about that. That's not going to get the results that we are all trying to get when we're working on crisis management and intervention. And then lastly on the list is to help the person, if and when the space calls for it, to identify those additional resources to help solve that problem. Okay, the third piece of the LEND process is to notice yourself. Honestly, for me as a clinician, this is the hardest part. If somebody's yelling at me, it is very hard for me not to want to yell back. That I don't know. Maybe that's a human thing. It's just hard, right? But that's absolutely not what de-escalation is about. That's what escalation is about. So we really need to be mindful about our own physiological responses. We need to calm our body. We need to make sure that our nonverbal messages are really consistent with the language that we're using. We need to be aware of the rate of our speech. I know I tend to speak very, very quickly. And one of the things with that is that, you know, people might get confused depending on what diagnostically they are experiencing. You want to slow down your rate of speech, and you want to think, again, on a neurochemical level. If you can reduce the amount of stimulus in the environment for someone, it's likely to, the lack of stimulus or the reduction in stimulus is likely to help calm them down. Remember that people have mirror neurons, right? And mirror neurons help us copy what's happening around us. So when we are as calm physically and as still as we can be ourselves, we really need to, you know, like take a noticeable deep breath and then use that as an opportunity to influence someone else's sort of state of being just in our connection with each other. So that mindful awareness over what is my internal state right now? How fast is my heart beating? How quick are my breaths? What's going, am I turning red? Like what is happening with me? And also, do my words match what I'm physically displaying to this other person? And really keep in mind, you know, keep that in mind. For me as a clinician, honestly, this is the hardest piece of the whole thing, because in the context of the pandemic specifically, and any of us in healthcare, we're already tired. We already have, all of us collectively have problems with emotion regulation. And so being able to regulate ourselves in such a way when in such a high tension environment becomes incredibly challenging. I want to acknowledge for a moment the question in the Q&A about blocking exit. It was said here that we've been told to make sure that as a staff member, we are closest to the exit so you can get out if there is danger. This is countering what you are suggesting. Interesting to hear your thoughts. Number one, I want to say that if there is a policy or a protocol at the clinic or in the hospital setting where you work, obviously those are the things that you need to follow. I don't want to make a suggestion that is counter to what you're being told to do on a policy level. The information that I am presenting to you today, the not blocking exits, specifically comes from disaster and correctional setting information. So it's counterintuitive. And I have to say that it doesn't necessarily apply, and I'm just going to be very frank, in an active shooter situation in a hospital, there are different sets of rules and there are different sets of procedures that you need to follow in case of an active shooter situation. So getting out and getting away is definitely a strong recommendation in that case. But in terms of interpersonal one-on-one de-escalation, you don't want to block an exit when you're working with someone. That's where I'm coming from. So I'm hoping that that's clarifying that as I go. I really wanted to include that in our conversation today. Thank you for asking. The last piece of the model of process in LEND is to decide. And this is sort of the last thing. This is where it becomes very, very tricky with equity related issues. And when we are already heightened, when we are in a place neurologically where we're having difficulty regulating ourselves, the biggest danger that I was mentioning when I was talking with Christina at the beginning is the misperception of violence or threat. And when we get physically uncomfortable, our brains are much, much more likely to perceive something as a threat rather than a challenge or just a difficult situation, right? So the mindful awareness that's necessary on the part of a clinician here to decide, like, how concerning is this? Like, is my safety actually threatened, or is this person really just, expressing themselves in a way that is very culturally normative, and I'm just not familiar with it. In some of the work that I've done internationally, I've had to adjust my thinking around, like, are people upset or are people just talking really loud? Because everywhere you go, there are different cultural norms about closeness of speaking, volume of speaking, hand gestures, all of that kind of thing. And if it's not something you're familiar with, it's a good process and a good procedure in general to step back and to not interpret something as being threatening or pathological or in fact even wrong, right, when it may not be. So it's better to err on the side of not interpreting it that way, and to decide I might have a shot here, especially with support of some of my colleagues, if I can get some other support to reduce risk. Having said that, at some point a decision does need to be made. And if you personally are flooded with adrenaline to the point where you feel threatened, you're probably not going to be able to engage in effective de-escalation very well anyway. So that gets tricky. And it's a quick thing. It happens over the space of seconds or minutes. It's not something that happens over, a space of an hour typically. So those are quick assessments and quick decisions that need to be made. And I will say this, if you can ever engage someone else's brain to help you and have a COVID brain buddy in doing this, that's going to be your best option, because two heads are better than one when it comes to making decisions in this evaluative context, for sure. Okay. I really appreciate the comment from Madeline in the chat about working with someone, and you can have a COVID brain buddy and a door buddy in terms of de-escalation. Those are good to keep in mind, area awareness and that kind of thing. Okay. There's a question in the Q&A that I'd like to address too here before I move on to assessment, which is, what if speaking calmly is antagonizing? I think you just have to kind of be aware about tone with that, because oftentimes people perceive calmness as being condescending. And so you want to make sure that you're genuine, but what you can do is just sort of slow down the rate of your speech, right? If you slow down how quickly you're talking and just make a little bit more space between things, it certainly doesn't have to come out as condescending or even like you're intentionally trying to be calm. Just take that breath, take a breath so that they can see your shoulders go up and down, so that you're visually clearly taking a deep breath, and then slow down the rate of your speech, even if you're not intentionally using vocabulary that is calming. It might have the desired effect, because I think what people pick up on when they're angry is condescension, and condescension is very, very close to dismissiveness, right? When people feel like they're being condescended to, the perception is that my concerns are being dismissed, and then that tends to escalate things. So, yeah. Okay, great. Moving forward, in the interest of time, we're going to talk about the content. So we're going to assess. That's the lend a hand part. The hand is the assessment. So this is the content areas that we want to evaluate as we're working forward. The first thing is health. And again, depending on where you are, you may be actually required to diagnose people, depending on what your job role is and what your duties are. But in the context of this model for de-escalation, you're just using powers of observation. And again, with a really important conceptualization here about how equity looks, be really careful about misappropriating hygiene issues and health issues with access to resources and socioeconomic status. So many visitors to our emergency departments do not have the resources and the access to healthcare that could influence the way that they physically present that are not necessarily diagnostic or indicative of risk or danger. It might be an unhealthy living environment that is not predictive in this case of risk associated with violence or acting out. So these are all good questions to consider. Ideally, you have a baseline from which to compare to, right? So you're working with a client or a patient with whom you have a familiarity and you can compare, are they physically presenting in a way that their health is compromised now compared to what it used to be, right? Oftentimes we don't have the luxury of that comparison. So you're trying to kind of off the cuff do an evaluation. And it's important, again, with active listening and answering questions to find out, where is this person living? Like, what are the conditions that they are consistently part of? What is their work? Because that could explain a lot about what's going on in terms of their physical presentation that we do not want to be evaluating as pathological or indicative of a different health condition. So not confusing hygiene with access to resources or just, other occupational or employment related things. At the bottom line here, this is the most important bullet probably. You are the best expert in the norms for the population that you serve. So whether that's an ED or an outpatient clinic or a school setting, you are the best expert in those norms. The A in the HAND acronym about content is about available resources. And as a clinical psychologist, right, I really appreciate a strengths-based perception. Everybody I've ever worked with has something. All human beings have strengths strengths that they might not identify as such, or they might not be aware of that they have available to them. So part of this assessment process is acknowledging and writing down even on paper, because when someone's panicking or very upset, they can't stay cognitively organized. The prefrontal cortex is offline. And so helping them identify, let's make a list and have them maybe help you do it. Internal strengths and external resources. What are the coping skills that people already have been using? I get asked very frequently, like, what about people with serious mental illness in this pandemic? Aren't they doing worse? And the answer is, it depends. Not always. You might think that would be the case because this is incredibly stressful, but people who have been managing mental illness for any number of months or years have a set of coping skills that they already know how to use and that they've been using and engaging. And they're in the same position 18 months in, right, where those resources are stretched, but they have a set of skills that they might not be acknowledging as being helpful to them right now. And that's where another eye or another sort of more objective viewpoint can help that person identify those things. Are there social connections? Are there coworkers? Are there kids and pets? I can't mention enough how many pets have saved lives this pandemic. With people being isolated, pets have really, really saved lives. And we made a huge mistake calling it social distancing instead of physical distancing, right? Because most people really need a lot of social connection. But there's a comment in the chat too about this where, anxiety went down significantly at the very beginning because the world slowed down and we went into some quarantine and lockdown. And it was like, there was an opportunity to take a breath for people who had underlying anxiety. Now that's not so much the case anymore. I think it's come back a little bit, but it's important not to make assumptions that underlying serious mental illness or chronic mental illness is actually working against people in the context that we're experiencing right now, because there are resources that they might not realize that they have going. Okay. The N in HAND in terms of content is about narrative. And that's putting your detective spidey sense together and learning not just from the words that they're saying, but the combination of things. And this is where it gets a little bit more diagnostic. Are they telling a linear story? Like, is there a thought process thing happening? Is there a speech content or a speech process thing happening that is concerning, that something doesn't quite make sense? Are you not asking open-ended questions, right? Are you giving them answers and they're just repeating back to you what you were just asking for? Is there a sense of hopelessness that, most of you probably know that hopelessness and depression are very, very linked to each other. And hopelessness is a fairly significant risk when it comes to self-harm, at least. So asking directly about hope and about paranoia, What are you worried about? What are the concerns? Kind of getting after these little pieces and putting together a narrative that helps you understand more about their story and what's going on with them. The last part of the HAND acronym is danger. And that, again, I can't say this enough. Having someone be upset and angry is not the same thing as having them be dangerous. And we really do a bad job often of misperceiving and sort of confusing those things with each other. Ask the person directly. It's totally okay. What is it that you would like to see happen here? What is it that you want or that you'd like to do, right? Be careful to note also that you in your own mind might have topics that you consider off limits or dangerous. And so that you're afraid to ask those open-ended questions, maybe because you're concerned about bringing up something that's a sensitive issue. That's a way that the bias that we hold implicitly can influence our ability to offer appropriate and helpful care to somebody who really needs it. So if someone does obviously indicate that they're an active or an immediate danger to others, then you're going to need to include additional supports. That's, in most professional healthcare settings of any kind, and even educational settings, there are protocols around people not handling that individually. So people in crisis should be asked about suicidal thinking or self-harm or types of thinking, even if that word suicidal is not something that everybody might be familiar with, right? Have you thought of harming yourself, or do you think about that? Engage whatever suicide. This is not a suicide prevention model specifically, but don't forget to engage suicide prevention training when needed. And then if you do believe that someone is an immediate threat to yourself or to someone else or to themselves, don't do that. Don't handle that on your own. That is something that we really need to get support around and get some collegial help with, for sure. Okay, just keeping an eye on the clock here. Options for the post-crisis period as people are moving into recovery. Try to ask the clients to assist in developing a coping plan. I'm calling it a client, patient, visitor, whomever it is, whoever the person is that you're serving. A coping card. There's different terminologies for these things depending on where you're working, and work with them to do it, right? There's power in that because it's not a doctor or any other professional saying, here's what you need to do. Go follow these instructions and call me in the morning or whatever, right? It's involving them in that process. And that by itself, the empowerment associated with that can work to prevent another crisis in the future. So having them identify triggers, warning signs for themselves, and then the bottom line is getting them to identify what they know works. Leave off the things that they've tried that don't work and don't reinvent the wheel, right? Think about behavioral activation. Think about very, very, very small steps in the right direction, and think about sensory interventions. All of those little skill sets, those clinical skill sets that you might be able to pull from, sensory work, anything that is temperature and touch related. Sometimes music is a wonderful calming factor for people, and allow them to develop that plan with you so that they can have it available for the next time. These last 3 slides are for you all as providers. And we had talked at the beginning about how important it is to care for ourselves and that you cannot pour tea out of an empty teapot. We cannot keep giving and caring when our own capacity is so limited. And establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries is essential to this. So the REST model, sorry, it's another acronym, is about how to concretely engage in some of that support for yourself that's going to reduce burnout and compassion fatigue. The first one is to reward yourself. Don't underestimate the power of positive reinforcement. Now, it's probably not a good idea to reward yourself in a way that makes things worse in the long run. Like, think about alcohol, think about food. Like, we have the neurological tendency to go a little bit over the top, and be careful about rewards because they have to stay healthy in order to be effective, right? So a bowl of ice cream and not the whole tub of Ben and Jerry's, so to speak. And then I mentioned several times how important it is to establish boundaries. Support each other in doing that and being unavailable when you're off. Sharing, connection, that's part of resilience. Connect with your colleagues. Nobody understands what it's like in the trenches as much as the people who are there with you. And facilitating that, if at all possible, with each other. And then the last one is to trust. There is a medical myth of indispensability. I don't know if you've heard of it, but there is one. And it is It's a myth for a reason. We all believe that we're the only one maybe who can help this client from beginning to end, or this patient. But it's a myth, because we have people who can also help. And I recognize that there are staffing shortages, and there might not be the options that there used to be. But no one person has to do everything, right? We have to be able to trust our networks and reach out and get that support that we need. Okay. Resilience development. These are the 4 ingredients of resilience. I've got this slide and one more content slide. And then if there are any other questions in the Q&A, I'm going to come back and address those. So purpose is the first one. Purpose is about identifying what are your motivators. As a clinician, as a human being, maybe as a parent, as a friend, what are the things that get you out of bed and keep you going, right? Our brains are so focused on survival right now in general that we lose sight of the things we're getting out of our work. And that actually does contribute to burnout and compassion fatigue. So when it comes to building up our sense of purpose, we need to go a little bit above and beyond in recognizing the good stuff. What are we getting out of the work? What are the things we still enjoy and that we really appreciate about the opportunities that we have to walk through people's lives with them in the way that we do? Try to set goals that are the right size. So short term, small scale, in order to enhance our sense of motivation and purpose as well. Connection is anything that prevents you from being isolated. So that can be to pets, like I mentioned. It can be to a higher power. It can be to any loved ones or family members. Humans are tricky right now because we have such strong opinions about so many different things. And there's a lot of family discord and family strife that has happened. So some of our connections that we had pre-pandemic are no longer available to us. And sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. There may be a grief and loss process associated with it, but we have to be mindful that whatever our connections look like, they're still important. And it's okay to let some go, and it's okay to work on developing new ones too, right? The third one is adaptability. And adaptability is the most important element of resilience, in my opinion. And it is about learning to get your brain to respond to an unexpected negative event as a challenge rather than a threat. So when you get a flat tire or you get a bad email, right, and something unexpected and negative happens, pay attention to how you physically respond. Do you get worked up? Does your heart rate increase? Do you turn red or feel warm? Does your respiration increase? That's an indicator that your body is perceiving that unexpected change as a threat. If you perceive something as a threat, you only have 3 options, right? You can run, hide, or fight. That doesn't work very well, like in the professional long run. If you can practice controlling your physiological response to an unexpected change and adapting it to a challenge, right? You think your way through it and you say, okay, I did not expect this and I don't like it, but what are my options here? I'm going to talk to this person. I'm going to write down pros and cons. I'm going to figure out what the next steps are to do. And when you perceive something as a challenge, the byproduct is hope. Threats don't feel hopeful, but challenges can be overcome. So those are the 4 things that are the ingredients of resilience. And yeah, that's kind of where it comes from, a combination of things. Okay. This is the last model. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, it's another acronym. Too many acronyms for today. This is just a summary for healthcare providers in general. And we've talked about all of these things today. So model resilience. Don't underestimate how important social learning is. We learn by watching other people. We don't do what we're told, right? So model that resilience. Engage in active listening, especially with our colleagues that need that support. Develop and establish and maintain those healthy boundaries. Identify pieces of a plan. In fact, I really don't like the term self-care because it feels like something else on the to-do list that nobody has time for anymore. What I mean by identify is make a list, just like you would work out with a person in crisis about what works for them, right? Do it for yourself. Put it on the refrigerator, have access to a list of things that you can do when you have 2 minutes or 2 hours and anything in between to make yourself feel a little bit better. Having that list concretely in front of you as we head into these fall and winter months is going to be really valuable, because the last thing you're going to want to do is come up with something on a bad day, right? So having it already accessible is important. And then the last thing is to change your expectations. let certain things go, and recognize that, we can't ignore the context of an 18-month disaster cascade and the way that that affects our ability to do the work that we love and that we want to do. Acknowledge effort on the part of kids and youth and yourselves and each other. Yeah, those are the things that we want to focus on. I think that's it. I will stop sharing and try to answer some of the questions. There are a few more. Deborah asked in the Q&A, any suggestions about remaining calm while being placed on hold for a half an hour and being disconnected? Oh boy. Yeah, I wish I had a magic answer for that one. I don't like that either. I think, assuming that while you're on hold, you can do other things. I think part of the issue with the anger around that is that it feels like wasted time, right? Maybe the issue didn't get solved because you have to call back, but if you can do other things while you're waiting, it's going to feel like less of an inconvenience. The other thing too is it's totally okay to be angry from time to time. Figure out a way to channel that. Go outside, scream if you need to just for a second. Don't scare the neighbors. Find a way to express what it is that you're feeling, because it's not always necessary or even reasonable to hold that in all the time, because it's going to come out somehow. So processing through and acknowledging that is helpful. Recommendations for holding boundaries and or for asking the client to come back when a conversation can be had. Yeah, that's essential. That is an essential thing. And I think the key in communicating about that is to not dismiss the person and to make a specific follow-up time, right? I can't talk right now. Let's meet on Wednesday at noon or whatever it is. I'm going to follow back up with you at this time on this day, but I can't keep talking right now. I'm sorry to have to move on. I have these other things, but I will follow up, and don't make it vague, right? I think part of what makes people upset is not knowing if that's just going to fly in the wind somewhere, but finding a concrete option to follow up is really important. And it has to be that way. You can't constantly stay talking and get stuck in situations with people, because that can go all day. So just start practicing it in small ways and try to be as concrete as you can. That's what I would suggest there. Okay. I don't know if there are any other questions. Yeah.
No, not in the Q&A though. We're still happy to get another one from anyone. Lots of very complimentary things in the chat, which is, of course, I'm expecting that.
Nice to see. I appreciate it.
But it's always nice to hear. Yeah. And so again, just as a pointer, we do have our evaluation, and the link has been posted in the chat. I think one says, I don't think one question has been answered. I will say, well, sorry, Angela, there was a reference to 4 areas that best practices were derived from to develop model. I missed the 4 areas. I apologize. I misread this question. So you said that. I don't think it was in a slide. So maybe you could.
It wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you. Sorry about that, Angela.
It came from correctional setting and correctional work. It came from disaster psychology and disaster behavioral health, clinical psychology, and industrial organizational psychology, workplace stuff. So those are the 4 academic areas that informed the model. Yeah.
Well, that's helpful. And again, we will generally, most times today specifically, we will have a Q&A and resource document. And so we can also that's why it's helpful to have the questions in the Q&A box as well, as we can go back and make sure we have, those accounted for, and we'll make sure that those 4 areas are included in the document as well. Other last things that you'd really want folks to walk away with from here?
I don't have anything else, I don't think, to add. I just want to acknowledge that no matter what job role you identified as having, all of you are here because you care about other people. And that desire to help people in some capacity and be better and feel more comfortable in this crazy situation is very, very admirable. And so I just want to acknowledge the value of the work that you all do, for sure.
Well, and in fact, we do have another question, and I hope it is maybe not about this webinar. It says, any tips for addressing issues on a Zoom call with other participants? So I'm going to guess that Lorraine is maybe talking about things feeling crisis laden, or how to interact best with your colleagues or other folks. I know folks are doing telehealth that weren't doing it before. But any thoughts on this answer? And Lorraine, if you have more clarity you want to add to your question, please feel free to throw that in, but I'll let Dr. Mauseth start with that.
I'm guessing what you're getting at too. I agree, Christina. It's probably around like high emotion things being expressed in Zooms maybe that are not appropriate. My experience with that in a variety of different Zoom settings is that usually when that's the case, it's because there isn't an opportunity for people to express things in a different way. And so what I would strongly recommend, and this is my industrial organizational psychology hat coming on, is that either in supervisory one-on-ones or in other team meetings, they need to be designed specifically to allow people to process other things that are going on. So you're not trying to fit in, how are you feeling with, here's the agenda and here are the business items that we have to pack down. Because that's when emotional non-work related things tend to really kind of creep through, is when people feel like they don't have the opportunity to ever express themselves. And so those like an additional meeting, like an additional group meeting specifically for behavioral health, like let's talk about what's going on, right? Or one-on-ones, either with peers or with a supervisor to do some active listening. Anybody can do active listening. It does not require a license or a certification. It's just a way we can hear other people, and it can happen in the workplace. And so facilitating a standard procedure and a process where active listening just becomes more of a norm, that will in part help address inappropriate Zoom stuff, because it allows people the opportunity to express themselves.
Well, and Lorraine did specify specifically people struggling with recovery. So again, this might be, maybe this is a telehealth setting. Maybe these are folks. I mean, I assume Lorraine is talking about clientele or patients. But I had heard this early on in the pandemic, where suddenly everyone was thrust into telehealth. And what do you do when you're actually witnessing, or you think you're witnessing something that could create or is in the middle of a crisis, while on a Zoom call? It's just not the same as being present. So maybe you could share just whatever you've heard about that.
Yeah, that is very challenging. It kind of goes both ways, because sometimes people are less safe or secure. There's less privacy in a Zoom setting too. So the resources are different, and the procedures that you would follow if you're doing outpatient therapy. If I'm doing therapy and something happens to a client in the background in a Zoom, like I would reach out to an intervening party at that point if I thought someone's safety was threatened, whether that's a public thing or whether that's a family member or any kind of contact who can intervene and provide support. So it's important to follow your organization's protocols for that kind of thing. And if you don't have one, then there needs to be one that's identified. But it depends on the circumstances. So sorry, I don't have something more concrete on that.
No, certainly. And I think, like you said, a lot of folks have rules in their organization, rules in their delivery of services. And when you're working in an environment or for an agency that talks about harm reduction, and that we don't exclude people from receiving services who might have used substances before we met them. Certainly in my past, I would never have anything to do if we didn't work with folks that were struggling at the time. But it puts just another burden to be witnessing. You're suddenly seeing things, and you just, I personally don't know how folks are handling telehealth. And if you see a beer can, are you supposed to not keep talking to them? But I think you just follow your own agency rules, and otherwise use those tips you had. So that's great.
And if it's peer, if it's not a client or a patient, if it's a peer, I would encourage people to reach out and ask. Not in that moment, but follow up with them, especially if you have a relationship or a friendship. Don't hesitate. People need to be checked in on. We need to reach out to each other. And so, don't hesitate to check in if you're concerned about what you're seeing from a colleague.
Yeah, that's another thing that we know. Unhealthy habits are at a high right now, no pun intended. It's really, I think everyone's experienced something, and it is very important to ask and check in with folks. So, all right. Well, Dr. Mauseth, thank you so much. We're going to just go to our outro slides. So don't hang up yet. Let me just share my screen. As this has been a fantastic session, but you've seen the sign up to our evaluation survey just takes a minute or two to fill out, and Dr. Mauseth gets a collated report. We look at them diligently and are really appreciative of any comments, things you want to see more of, things you wish you got out of this webinar, because I imagine you'll be doing something like this a lot of places, and always appreciate the feedback. So I really, really appreciate all that from people. A couple upcoming webinars we do have coming up this month. In about a week, we have a webinar from a fabulous new partner on transgender mental health. And so Ryan will be sharing really great tips and helpful practices for us in the field. And then a colleague and partner we've worked with for a long time, Rebecca Demerol, will be doing that later in that week, Safe, Sane, and Stable in Turbulent Times. So please visit our event calendar. I think that's been posted in our chat. The latter one will be stress management and skills for providers using trauma-informed approaches. So if you haven't connected with us, you can find out more about us and register for additional resources and training opportunities, get our newsletter, and you can also email us with any questions or follow us on social media. Again, thank you to Dr. Mauseth, and we really appreciate you all taking the time to learn about this. And it's an ongoing process, and we will see you next time.